a mirth moment. Yes? You want a mirth moment? Yes. Okay. This is entitled Goat for Dinner. The young couple invited their elderly pastor for Sunday dinner. Let's do another mirth moment. No, I knew the risks. I ran with this one. While they were in the kitchen preparing the meal, the venerable minister asked their son what they were having. Goat, the kid replied. Goat? Replied the startled man of the cloth. Are you sure about that, son? Yep, said the youngster. I heard Mom and Dad say, today is just as good as any to have the old goat for dinner. Just so you know, I don't eat dinner, so. This is called, since we've had a couple of Irish jokes, and they've been appreciated apparently, this is the Italian boy's confession. We're in a little hill town in Italy, one of those beautiful medieval hill towns that you see in the center of Italy. And there's a church, of course, Catholic church, and it's time for confession. So this kid goes up to the confessional and says, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I have been with a bad girl. The priest asked, is that you, little Johnny Parisi? Yes, Father, it is. And who was the girl you were with? I cannot tell you, Father. I don't want to ruin her reputation. Well, Johnny, I'm sure to find out her name sooner or later, so you may as well tell me now. Was it perhaps Tina Minetti? I cannot say. Was it Teresa Volpe? I'll never tell. Was it I'm sorry, but I cannot name her, Father. Was it Kathy Pirano? My lips are sealed. Was it Rosa D'Angelo? Please, Father, I cannot tell. The priest sighs in frustration. You're very tight-lipped, Johnny Parisi, and I admire that. But you've sinned, and you must atone. You cannot attend Mass for 1 month. Now you go and behave yourself. So Johnny walks back to his pew, and his friend Nino slides over and whispered, what do you get? A month's vacation and 5 great leads. I don't know whether you're fond of verse or not, but there is some verse that I enjoy, and I particularly enjoy 17th century English verse. I think that's partly because I was made to learn it in school. Not Milton, please. I got so tired of his 6-foot lines, and those rhythmic Alexandrines used to drive me round the bend. So I'm not going to scan this. There will be no scansion. But this is by a poet called Henry Vaughan, who died in 1695. Beautiful lines, truly, but they demonstrate something that I want to share with you. Oh, how I long to travel back and tread again that ancient track. Some men a forward motion love, but I by backward steps would move, and when this dust falls to the urn, in that state I came, return. He yearns desperately for some past where the human being, the human nature, was not fallen. There's a strong yearning for this in Europe especially, and in England particularly, during the 17th century. There's a feeling that human nature has fallen perhaps irretrievably, that there's sin, evil everywhere present, and that if we could just get back to that state from which we originally emerged, all would be well. It's a sad longing. The Germans have a great word for it, Sehnsucht, which is actually hardly translatable. Sehnsucht means longing, desire, a feeling that somehow, if we could reach a state that's unreachable, we'd be okay again. Well, that was the 17th century. But the lesson that it offers that I want to point out is that for many people, the notion of movement through life has an ambiguity attached to it. We hear a lot today about living in the moment, which I think incidentally illustrates our lack of comfort with the notion of past and future. Somehow we feel, if I could live in a crystallized moment, choose the best one I could find, if I could live in that moment, prolong that moment, everything would be all right. If I could live in the moment. But there is no moment. It's a convenient psychological device. It helps us get through tough situations sometimes, but we can't live in a moment. Life is made up of successive moments, past, present, and future. There is no real present. It's like saying, where is the Greek dimensionless point? Does it exist? No, it doesn't. It's a convenient fiction. If we abandoned the past, if we forgot it entirely, which we're rapidly beginning to do, incidentally, we would lose our foundation of all morality. Where would we look for the lessons that we have learned? I'm not foolish enough to say that we'll repeat the errors that we've repeated in the past, but at least knowing about our past gives us a sense of connection, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of destiny, but also it's the root and ground of our morality and of our understanding of what life truly is. And the future. Of course, the future isn't certain. There are a few people who believe that they can see into the future. Perhaps they can. Perhaps they can. I had a mother who was a great natural psychic. She could see future events and actually predict them, but she would say, they don't have to be that way. There is always the possibility of change. Make a decision, and it can be changed. That's your fundamental free will. And that also is the power of choice. If you take choice away from a human being, if you take choice away, the possibility of making a different decision as life moves forward, you rob that person, really, sometimes even of sanity, to believe that you're driven solely in one direction. This is what's wrong with the theological notion of God as a predestined thinker. And I won't go into theology with you. We don't want to be here all day, and I don't want you to fall asleep just yet. The fact of the matter is, we move. We move forward. And the notion of forward movement gives us also this sense of choice. I'm introducing a visual metaphor, and I haven't mentioned it yet, and I'm just about to. And when I do, when I give this to you, this visual metaphor, you will never forget it. I guarantee. You will not forget it. And I'll tell you how I happened upon this myself. I went to a school, a boys' school in another country, which was considered run on Christian lines. That was Christianity. I really didn't want anything to do with it. But it did reassure the parents who thought that their kids would get a break there. They didn't. But I can always remember in one of the classrooms, there was hung a picture of Jesus knocking at a door. Knocking at a door. I am not a lover of Victorian art, except maybe some of the pre-Raphaelites. I think that painting's by a man called Holman Hunt. But it's of Jesus knocking at the door. And when I began to read Scripture and become interested in it from an historian standpoint, I found that Jesus himself had fastened on to this visual metaphor for his own teaching. He said at one point, I am the door through which you may pass. My teachings, in other words, will help you enter a fuller state of consciousness and awareness. But obviously, the door was important to him. I'll just read a couple of references that he makes to the door. He says, knock, and the door will be opened. Very simple utterance. But it establishes the door as the central metaphor for what he is teaching there. And you go over into John, and he says, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. What he says, in many translations, is in my Father's house there are many rooms. And every room, of course, has a door to it. Some religions have understood that the significance of the door can be of extreme help to us as we move through life. Indeed, there's one religion whose founder was named the Bab. That really means the gate rather than the door, but the notion is the same. Through these teachings, or through the spiritual understanding that we gain by following such teachings, we shall open a new realm of understanding. I once spent a long, long time trying to explain to a dear French friend the difference in English between a gate and a door. If you want to try, go ahead. I think gates are more or less outside and doors are inside. But then he said to me, what about front doors? And so I didn't know what to do at that point. Never argue with the French. They're very, very clever. They're trained in metaphysics. Truly, in the schools. So I've tried to see my life basically centered around this notion of doors. And that's what I want to introduce into your minds this morning. Seeing life as doors. And there are 100 ways in which you can interpret this imagery. For example, there are doors, are there not, that must be closed behind us. How many times do we go through life leaving a door behind us open or ajar, allowing us perhaps to glance back over our shoulders and see into the room that door opens out from? There are experiences that are best left there. I remember many, many years ago when Carol and I were traveling from Montreal to London on a little Polish steamer, passenger vessel, tiny one, right up the St. Lawrence River, beautiful trip, but it had bunks. The cabin had bunks. None of these suites that we get today when we book these fancy cruises. Just had bunks. And for some reason, I took the lower bunk and Carol took the top bunk. I don't know why we did that. Certainly wasn't room for both of us. Bunks had a nasty habit, too, of folding up like Murphy beds before you were ready to leave them. But I can remember now, halfway across the Atlantic, I was asleep in my lower bunk, and I had this dream. There's an experience that I had in my youth that was very unpleasant, very frightening, very alarming, and I'd never been able to get rid of it. I'd rehearsed it and rehearsed it and rehearsed it. And you know something? When you rehearse a past event like that, it grows and grows and grows in significance, out of all proportion, probably, to the importance it originally had. Because just by constantly reiterating, rehearsing it in consciousness, going through it, it expands. It's like blowing air into a balloon. Anyway, I had this dream, and I suddenly saw a door accompanying the event that had taken place and had troubled me for so long. And I slammed that door with decision. I closed it decisively, like one of those grand old Victorian doors. How I miss them. These wretched little pressboard things, they're I want an oak door 6 inches thick so I can slam it. So I slammed this door, and I felt so good in my dream, if it was a dream, in my dream, that I shot upwards in bed and brained myself on the bottom of her bunk. However, sometimes one has to suffer in order to learn. No gain without pain. But you see, the door can be used in this sense. I know it sounds trivial. I know it sounds juvenile. It may even sound infantile. It sounds silly, but it works. I'll go for anything that works. Yes, I can close doors on past experiences and keep them closed. Learn from them, certainly. Certainly, of course we learn. But don't let those open doors to unhappy or unpleasant past experiences rob us of the vitality of our lives as we move forward. Because life does demand that forward movement. It does. It's calling us. And we in Unity teach that there can be no growth, spiritual growth and awareness without transformation. And you can't have transformation without movement from one state to another. And I'm not talking moving from Washington to Oregon. Though some people have told me you've got a better chance of being spiritual in Oregon than you have in Washington. I don't know how they figure that one out. Never mind. We won't examine Oregonians. But heavens, there may be some amongst us today. Yes. So, another thing, too, about doors. Doors remind you that in life there are always possibilities as you move along. We have it within us to pass through many, many different doors. How many doors have you passed by or closed that probably contained behind them interesting opportunities? It's true. It's true. I look back, the older you get, the worse or better this gets, believe me. I look back and see all those missed opportunities. Were they good? Were they bad? Were they indifferent? But I shut the doors to them because I wanted to move towards a different door, possibly. But it's interesting sometimes to evaluate possibilities in terms of opening another door. I think it was St. Teresa of Avila who said the soul contains millions of doors that will never be opened. Opportunities that await us that we choose not to follow, that we don't have the time perhaps to follow. I've known people who've had relationships that might have developed had they opened a specific door, but they chose not to. This again gives us the power of choice. Choice is of huge importance to us as human beings. We have that free will. If our lives were determined, we would be nothing but robots. And we're not. We are not. We have that power of choice. When I was a young man, I thought, mistakenly, that I would like to become a psychologist or even a psychiatrist. So I opened a door to that possibility. Those were in the days when the study of psychology was dominated by the behaviorists. It's a little like the Jesuits. Give me somebody, and within 6 or 7 months or years, I'll condition them. We see the dangers of conditioning today, don't we, in this terrorist nonsense, this madness. It's easy to condition human beings, to tell them, you don't have a choice, you've got to do it one way. My way or the highway, yeah? But I was so put off by what I discovered. I think I accumulated about 15 hours of psychology, all the Psych 101 stuff and all of that nonsense, at a Jesuit school, incidentally. And coincidence? I don't know. But one thing that appalled me was the rats in the maze bit. Conditioning those rats so they didn't have any choice in the maze. They had to go down one avenue to get that little pellet of food. And the rats that were forced to do this, the rats that had choice taken away from them, they shriveled and died. Literally, I'm not kidding. They lost their fur. They became there's nothing worse than an unhappy rat. They're very sweet, really. It's the tails that put one off. But they are, poor little faces, But the rats that had choice, not a flattering comparison, admittedly, but the rats that had choice, similarly, it's true of us. They were the ones who flourished and who grew, and I suppose became more rat-like. But I learned that lesson at least from my pre-psych work, that if you give a creature choice, you give that creature a greater life, an expanded life, indeed life itself. And the doors that surround us and the doors that await us even offer and confirm the possibility of choice in our lives. It doesn't have to be that way if you don't want it to be. I mean, maybe the other choice is not a happy one. Maybe it's an unpleasant one even, but we have a choice to avoid a certain pathway if we wish. This is fundamental to our human natures and part of our spiritual understanding, awareness, and development, and we should remember it. But of course, there's always one more door, isn't there? And it's the last door, isn't it? And it's the door that we can't avoid, because it's the door, some people say, to death. To death. Death, ugly word. La mort. Tod in German. It's pretty decisive. I love German because it's so in your face. But there's no such thing. There's no such thing as death in this universe. It's life. Life in a myriad dimensions. We may be sitting in the midst of multiverses. Even many of our physicists acknowledge this to be the possibility. Nothing dies. Everything is transmuted, changed. That's true, but nothing dies. That final door through which we all must pass, is the door, in my estimation and opinion, to the greatest promise we shall ever encounter. Eternal life revealed. In what way, in what shape, in what form? Come to the forum next week after church. If you want to discuss life after death, I'll do it. Life before birth, because you can't have life after death if you don't contemplate the possibility of life before birth. It's a continuum. We live, we exist, we move, we have our being in that which made us. Nothing can take that from us. The final door may for many people be the dread door, but it is potentially the most wonderful door we shall ever open. What joy it may be to pass through that into a fuller realization of who and what we are. Doors, doors, doors. Take the idea, take the metaphor, do what you want with it, but you'll never forget that life is filled with doors, some to open, some to close. Thank you, I'm finished.